Children can feel emotionally abandoned, and they can live with invisible traumas that are much harder to see. What happens is it starts to disrupt the developing nervous system in a child. Hi, this is Jim Brillon. Welcome to this YouTube channel where we discuss all things mental health. The topic today is complex PTSD, or sometimes referred to as complex trauma. I think this is a condition that a lot of people don't understand, so I wanted to shed some light on it. I think people generally understand the concept of PTSD and what we think of as shock trauma. These are things like being involved in a war situation, or something like a tragic school shooting, or a sexual assault or physical assault. That's what we think of as shock trauma, and that can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. Complex trauma is something very different as far as the way that it starts to impact people, but it can have the same kind of impacts on people. Complex PTSD is caused from repeated and often invisible negative experiences, often beginning in childhood. It could be childhood abuse, it could be neglect, situations where a child feels like they have no control over the situation and they have no hope and they have no way to escape it, because kids basically are dependent on their early caregivers for their existence. And when home life or life in general just feels unpredictable, dangerous, when parents are rageful or inconsistent, children can feel emotionally abandoned, and they can live with invisible traumas that are much harder to see than the things that we see in shock trauma. What happens is it starts to disrupt the developing nervous system in a child, and it can cause problems with their emotional and psychological development. So it's very different from shock trauma in those ways, and it can actually affect a child as they're growing because of acts of commission, such as abuse, neglect, or omission. Things that they just don't get from their parents. And this is when we start to connect these with attachment wounds and attachment disruption. When a child starts to develop attachment wounds or attachment disruption, what happens is that leads to problems often with regulating their emotions, their behaviors, and their attention. And growing into adulthood, this is when we start to see things manifesting like bipolar disorder or ADHD, or even borderline personality disorder, and even chronic physical pain. And what happens often is that the children that are impacted more severely are children that are sensitive or quote-unquote intense. This is actually a phenomenon that not a lot of people understand either. There are people that are born with more highly sensitive nervous systems. This does not mean that they're more vulnerable. It means that they're more sensitive, literally that their nervous systems are more porous. They pick up more input from the environment. They notice things more. They feel people's energy. And when these types of children are raised in a healthy environment, they grow up to be tremendously gifted people. They do exceedingly well. When they grow up in a dysfunctional family system, they're impacted much worse. And often these are the children that end up taking on the role or being put in the role of a scapegoat. A scapegoat is the child that, because they're more aware, they can actually see the dysfunction in the family, and sometimes they speak up about it. And if you're living with a parent who is a narcissist or has some other mental health disorder, that child is sometimes blamed. There's sometimes the parent will project their shame, all their issues onto that child. And the scapegoat is the one that ends up carrying much of the burden of the dysfunction. Children can also end up being parentified, meaning that they grow up up too early. They end up taking care of their other siblings or even their parents, because maybe the parents, because of their own mental illness or substance abuse, the kids end up taking on roles of, cooking and cleaning and waking mom up, when she's drunk to go to work. Often what happens is kids grow up with emotionally immature parents or unavailable parents. And this also could be because of many reasons. It could be because of the parent's mental illness, because they're working too much. Could be because the parent themselves is maybe on the autistic spectrum or has ADHD. And unfortunately, what happens is there's a very important aspect of developing attachment called mirroring. And this is what a child needs to develop attachment, healthy attachment. They need to be shown who they are and shown their strengths, and they need to be recognized and mirrored. They need healthy parents that can show them what they're good at, show them what their talents are, and reflect their goodness to them. The whole attachment topic is actually very deep and very complex. And ultimately, what a child needs to develop a healthy attachment, which is basically a template for relationships and feeling safe in the world, they need 5 key things. They need to feel a sense of being safe and protected. They need to feel that they're attuned to by their parents. Their parents have to be able to notice what they need and be willing and wanting to meet those needs. They need to experience being soothed and comforted when they're in distress, and they need to experience something referred to as expressed delight. What that means is a child needs to see reflected in their parents' eyes and faces that they're in love with them, that their parents take pleasure in them, that they just get a kick out of being with them. They laugh at their silliness and they just love to be with them. A child needs to experience that in order to develop healthy attachment. And finally, a child needs support and encouragement to grow into their best version of themselves for their own personal development. Not the person that the parent wants them to be, but the person that that child is meant to be. So those are some of the very important elements of healthy attachment. And when children don't get that, they develop anxious, insecure, preoccupied, or sometimes a disorganized attachment. And that is a huge part of what we think of as complex PTSD or complex trauma. Just to say a little bit more about highly sensitive children or highly sensitive persons, if you want to read more about it, there's some excellent writing by a psychologist named Elaine Aron, A-R-O-N, who talks about these traits in people. These children are, again, they're not more vulnerable, but they're more sensitive because they pick up things in the environment, and they're often what are thought of as gifted children. Another book to read if you're interested in learning more about some of these dynamics regarding attachment and sensitive children is a book by Alice Miller called The Drama of the Gifted Child. So some of the other issues that can happen when this complex PTSD starts taking place is enmeshment in the family. This is when there's a codependence, and rather than parents being avoidant, they're actually too enmeshed. And children hear messages like, I can't live without you, or, don't grow up and move away. You can't go. This is parental enmeshment. And another issue that happens is parental oppression. So this parental oppression, jealousy, and competition is what happens when a parent is actually threatened by a child developing their own talents and abilities. And children can live with chronic invalidation, chronic criticism, which leads them to doubt themselves and feel guilt and shame even for succeeding. So some signs and symptoms of complex PTSD are things like dissociating or feeling numb or dead inside. When you grow up believing that there's something wrong with you, you might have high levels of anxiety or experience hypervigilance, meaning that you're always on guard, noticing, waiting for something to happen. You might have problems regulating your emotions because your nervous system is dysregulated. And you might engage in numbing behaviors or compulsive behaviors, avoidant behaviors. Often what happens is people develop intimacy disorders, and those attachment issues are actually triggered in intimate relationships. And sometimes you grow up to self-sabotage yourself. All that said, there is actually a lot of hope with treatment, and treatment generally involves helping to lessen the impact of shame, coping with the inner critic, that inner voice that tells you all kinds of bad things about yourself, learning how to regulate your nervous system and develop energetic boundaries, how to cope with avoidant and compulsive behaviors, also developing mindfulness and self-compassion, making connections between your body and your mind and your emotions, processing those toxic family dynamics, and developing a sense of internal safety. So that's hopefully what people can achieve through treatment. And that can be done through various forms of therapy, including cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, trauma work, something that I work with called the Ideal Parent protocol, which is attachment healing, also developing mindfulness, addiction and recovery often, and recognizing and honoring what healthy boundaries look like, and including recognizing what a highly sensitive person is and how to actually honor those traits, and rather than seeing it as a deficit, as a strength. I hope this answers some questions for you as far as complex PTSD. And if you have any further questions, put a comment in the box below. Let me know what you think. Sign up for notifications and subscribe and like, and I look forward to sharing more information with you later. Take care.